Hello, my name is Host Eric, and I'm talking with famous people, and I want to talk about conflicting values basically today, and areas in which humans are likely to experience disputes over what ought to be done. So, we have various kinds of disputes. Some of them are about what's true in a truth value per sentence kind of a way. Now, sentences have truth values, statements do. All statements have a truth value, but for some of those statements, a truth value is fairly meaningless. I like pizza has a truth value of either true or false, but it's dependent entirely on whether you decide you actually like pizza. So it's kind of meaningless. If I say silence is golden, it has a truth value of false because literally silence isn't golden, but it's not meant like that. It's meant metaphorically. So there's a limit to what we can do with the logical understanding of a truth value of a statement, and usually we're not arguing a whole lot about statements where the truth value is significant, statements which have a significant truth value, that's what's in dispute. And if that's the case, then the facts are in dispute. We're almost never having those kind of arguments. It's not in dispute whether or not the cop shot the black guy who was lying on the ground with his arms up in the air, Charles Kinsey. That's not in any dispute. What's in dispute is the interpretation. It's like some people interpret it to require. Why are there so many people driving back here today? Lacey, shut up. To require. My train of thought. Okay, so people have different understandings of what we're talking about when we say the word true or right or wrong. So is it true that a cop shot Charles Kinsey? Yes. Can we say it's true that cop ought to be found guilty of attempted murder? Well, that's a trickier one to answer. I would say yes, but or at least negligent assault with a deadly weapon or something like that. But it's harder to say that statement is absolutely true or false. One can say that it's the strongest position, the most well supported, but then you got to get into your arguments about, well, what are we using to support these positions? So the thing about it is points of dispute. Again, we're rarely going to be disputing the facts. Almost always, points of dispute are interpretive. Okay, so one way in which we encounter points of dispute is that we may be using a different set of statements for different reasons for ourselves. So if I'm using political statements that say, Obama is the worst criminal that ever happened in this country, and we need to clear those Democrats out of here, and we need to blah, blah, blah. What I'm using political statements for is to personify status quo failures in the system so that I have somebody to not like, since I can't solve the actual problem and I'm not thinking about the actual problem correctly. So if we want to reduce the political discussion to individuals, what that is a point of dispute over the methodology by which we ought to solve problems. So if you're saying, well, the problem is the Democrats, or these politicians or those politicians, then you are operating on an assumption that problems get solved by people, individuals, rather than applications of processes. And while only individuals can take action, no problem can be meaningfully addressed through individual action alone. It has to be a process that is executed for a reason if it's going to have any chance of solving any problem. Because to say that we're going to try to address a problem means, one, we've defined a problem. We defined it as a problem. So one point of dispute is regarding how to address problems. One point of dispute in that sub area of how to address problems is whether or not problems necessitate actions. So there's something you might call the lightning detector response. And I use that expression because there's a mother in Florida whose child was struck by lightning in a park while playing softball, and it was a very tragic story. She ended up in a coma. I think she died when she was like 20 or something, and she was in a coma for a long time, and then semi-vegetative state, and I don't know. It was pretty tragic. The point is, this mother then avidly pursued getting legislation passed to install lightning detectors in the parks in Florida that indicate when a certain combination of humidity and barometric pressure and whatever else make lightning likely. So now, just because somebody gets struck by lightning does not mean that we need to install lightning detectors in all the parks. This is a perfect example of a dispute not of action, not of problem, but of jurisdiction. Which problems require group action, which problems require individual action, and which problems require no action. And certain problems do, right? For sure. If my current problem is that my carrots that I've planted aren't done growing yet, the action I need to take is to let them grow. I don't need to interfere at all. So inherency is a big point of any kind of dispute. Is the problem in the status quo being described an actual problem, or is it a feature of a healthy system? Every healthy system is going to have elements within the system that are losers within that system. So note that human beings are winners and losers across multiple systems. Some people are more handsome, some people are more friendly, some people are more smart, some people are more rich, some people are more, have a better work ethic, some people have a worse work ethic. Some people are more spendthrift, some people are less spendthrift. All of these various vectors that people are on, right? So our natures express themselves in unequal ways fundamentally from the natures of our fellows. Those inequalities go a long way in explaining when and where we have disputes. When we have disputes about individual behaviors and the people around us, those disputes as somebody just signed divorce papers yesterday, it's weird. I just can't help but think that those disputes require the same fundamental solvency approach as any other dispute. That you've got to argue it out fairly. That's the only thing you can ever do. To argue it out fairly. The problem with individual personal disputes is there's a lot of things that the argument is simply this. I don't feel good. You're not making me feel good. You're not making me feel good enough. Or I'm not feeling good enough, and I believe it to be the case that if I were with the right person, I would feel good enough. And so there's really no disputing that. It's not an argument per se, so much as, it's kind of like what I talked about at the beginning of this afternoon session, where you got an individual who's got a vision of what things ought to be like in their head, and the world is not conforming to it, and their significant other is not conforming to her vision of what he should be. There's nothing much more to say than that. I can argue that your vision's wrong. I can argue that you got grass is greener syndrome and say that, in fact, you're not going to discover that the vision you have is true, or that, in fact, you're going to discover that it's an artifact of childhood misunderstanding about what ought to be in general, to have internalized stuff that was as normative rather than descriptive. So, points of dispute, then, they're almost always framework points of dispute, but we often argue them on contention level. when somebody's advocating for, well, we have to keep at least like hard drugs illegal. We can't just let like crack be legal or something like that. They're arguing it from a combination of things, right? They're saying, well, first of all, I understand the mechanism of crack smoking, namely that it makes you feel good and makes you want to get more crack. And that, number two, addiction is a real thing, and that people do have problems with addiction. Number three, we can correctly anticipate that if we legalize crack and make it more available, we get at least some people who are not currently addicted become addicted. And number four, society has a reasonable claim to structuring rules to prevent huge societal health problems like crack addiction from consuming our communities. So those are the sort of arguments that somebody might make in favor of keeping crack illegal. But that point of dispute there then is not about, well, it's about two different things. On the one hand, the person's making claims about what will happen. So it's a predictive argument, and a lot of times the dispute will be over whether or not those predictions are accurate, because the data doesn't actually support what seems intuitively to be obvious, namely that if you make drugs legal, you increase their usage. Now, we don't have infinite data, but we do know that. What's a more interesting question, though, to argue is not so much the specific utilitarian outcomes of criminalization or decriminalization of this or that drug, but rather the question of framing of how you justify these laws and how you consider the impacts of the laws. See, in the argument that says keep crack cocaine illegal because it's too risky, blah, 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 we don't factor in the damage to those who are arrested for doing crack cocaine. We simply aren't even thinking about it as a legitimate concern. But of course it is concern, because whether or not we make it illegal, people will be doing crack cocaine. We know that. So then the question is, well, what's best for them? The person who's advocating let's keep it illegal isn't factoring in the consideration that it's not working currently. If it's a problem still, it's not working currently because it's illegal. If you're saying it's not a problem now because it's been illegal, therefore we shouldn't get rid of the fix. Okay, that's a sensible argument, but there's no evidence to back up the fact that increased criminalization actually reduces drug use. At best, it redirects drug use to different drugs, potentially worse ones. So, when we're having those points of dispute, then, there's a couple of points of dispute. The first point of dispute ought to be this. You aren't considering the status quo and the impacts of criminalization in your impact calculus. So let's make sure you do include that first, and then we can move forward and talk about whether we ought to prioritize the impact calculus or the or the framework issue. I would say in that instance we prioritize individual rights, but I'm not ready to have that discussion until you can at least establish in fact that your utilitarian claims are accurate, because the evidence doesn't show it from the past, and there's no reason to conclude that maintaining the status quo will cause new things to happen. So those points of dispute then are about assumptions. A lot of people operate making arguments with certain assumptions in their head and don't account for those assumptions and don't consider what those assumptions imply. So in that case, you get a point of dispute over assumptions. You could also get a point of dispute over conclusions about morality. So if you use two different metrics, you might draw different conclusions about something. If you're a utilitarian, you might say, well, utilitarian metric says, yes, let's take the money from the poor people and let's take the money from the rich people and give it to those poor people because it has produced utilitarian benefits. In this particular instance, I can show you for sure, Eric, these people have benefited from this government program. We should therefore do it. And in no uncertain terms, it's utilitarianly justified. You can make that claim, and then I can make the claim, well, I agree it's utilitarianly justified in this instance, but my position is we shouldn't do it anyway because of deontological concerns. In that instance, you're actually debating what mechanism ought we use to determine whether something's right or wrong. That's the point of dispute then. If you're a particularist or a relativist and you're saying, well, we have to respect other people's cultures, blah, 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 the point of dispute is actually, ought we apply reciprocal burdens? If it's okay for them, then it must be okay for me too, or vice versa. If it's not okay for them, it's not okay for me. Why is it a relativist will have something that's not okay for me, but it's okay for those people over there? If it's not okay for me for rights violations reasons, or because my dignity precludes it, why would it be okay to do it to somebody else? So that's the issue that is really in dispute there. If you're talking to a particularist or a relativist, is the issue of reciprocal burdens. So the thing is, the reason I'm talking about this video is sort of rambly and sort of all over the place, and I'm coming to a close right now, is if we can narrow down where the actual point of dispute is, then we can avoid a lot of pointless back and forth that's not productive. And also, it tends to maybe cause some hurt feelings or something. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.